Today we begin the story of our salvation. Today is the beginning of the most holy week of the year. During this week we walk with Jesus as he did those mighty acts that ensure us that God is always with us, always forgives us, and will never abandon us. Even if we can't gather together as we did in the past, we can remember this week, make it part of our lives, and have God's story shape us as a people. Today we heard, and a few of us enacted with Susana Distancia as our guide, how Jesus entered into Jerusalem. Then we heard the story of how that journey ended. It ended with Jesus on the cross. This isn't the whole story. The story ends with Easter. But this particular part of the story tells us something important about being Christians and how we act in an uncertain world. The story of Holy Week is the story of an act of resistance followed by the ultimate act of compassion. First, the resistance. The entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, humbly riding on a donkey, was an act of resistance. It was very deliberately aimed at the oppressive combination of political and religious power in Roman-occupied Israel. The Gospel of Matthew that we heard at the beginning of the service makes it clear by quoting the prophet Zechariah. Jesus knew the crowds and the priests would immediately know what he was doing. He was enacting the defeat of God's enemies and the triumph of God's reign that Zechariah had promised. He may well have been deliberately resisting Roman power. Many biblical scholars argue that it is very possible that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, may have entered Jerusalem either on that day or slightly around when Jesus did. And Pilate would certainly not have entered riding on a donkey. He would have entered in full Roman glory on a splendid horse or in a chariot surrounded by Roman troops. By entering on a donkey, Jesus showed what a true prophet of the reign of God looks like. Humble, coming to serve, not to be served, coming not with violence behind him, but with shouts of praise for God, coming not with swords and spears, but with palm branches, coming to save, not to oppress. Jesus resisted the powers of the world that resist God. Second, the compassion. The gospel today is the story of the passion of Jesus. This is the word we used to describe this story. Passion originally meant suffering. Jesus willingly entered into suffering for the sake of the world. He stood before Pilate and did not defend himself. He suffered whipping, a crown of thorns, public humiliation, and crucifixion. He suffered all the evil and violence that the world could give, and he did not react with violence. This was suffering, passion, but it was also suffering with compassion. Jesus suffered with the world. In Jesus, we know that God knows our suffering. God is with us in our suffering willingly. The passion of Jesus is compassion. We are to resist evil with compassion. That is the way of Holy Week and a guide for all our lives. Right now, trapped in our homes, it can be difficult to know what to do. But we can follow Jesus and have his same passion for the reign of God. The reign of God will be fully realized when the world is free from all that makes us suffer: human evil, lack of care for the sick, poverty, destruction of the environment. The world is suffering right now. We are suffering from fear, from the loss of our normal lives, from governments that seem to value the preservation of their power over the health of their people. I hope I am wrong, but I suspect that in the coming weeks, Mexico will begin to suffer even more, and it will be the poor, the old, the sick, and the vulnerable who suffer most. But even stuck in our homes, we can resist and offer compassion. We can resist the temptation to simply blame. We can resist the temptations to guard our money, our wealth, and our power over the needs of the world. We can resist despair. We can resist doubt. We can resist loss of faith. We can do this however we can. We can pray. We can keep feeding people at Santa Juliana de Norwich, a ministry supported by your generous donations. We can donate money to other people working to heal the sick. We can resist putting our needs above those of others. We can offer compassion. We can call the homebound. We can connect with our church and others online. We can offer words of hope. We can simply listen to those who are afraid or sad and be with them in their suffering, being compassionate. The story is not over. This Holy Week, we, the church, Christ's church, the body in the world of Christ, we can enter this story, even if only online. But the story is powerful. It is a story that has changed the world and a story that will continue to change the world, even now, if we believe and act with resistance and act with compassion. Today begins the story of our salvation. Our salvation is that God is always with us, always forgives us, and will never abandon us. Even now, if we act and believe with resistance and compassion.